NASW is amazing for putting on relevant and engaging presentations throughout the year. So I appreciate the work that I get to do with you guys. And like Amelia said, above all else, the work that we get to do with the veteran committees and panelists and experts who agree to be part of these presentations. So I've been in the field for a little over 15 years now. It's scary to put numbers to things sometimes. I've had the pleasure and honor to work clinically with veterans and their families during that time and have learned so much through that work. And one of the main tools that I learned early in my career was that of active listening for all populations, but I didn't know much about active duty service members and veterans going into the field, and really just learned so much from the clients that I got to work with in that first year or so, and still now, like, I'm still learning. So I always just like to empower the audiences. I know we have a lot of people signed on today. If this is a topic that you're very familiar with and consider yourself, well versed in, then that's great. We can always learn more. I'm always learning myself. If you're new at this and you're nervous, unsure, really want to work with veterans or family members, but not sure how to do that, the first step is always just listening and learning. So you're in for a treat today. I will set the stage and give some educational content just to kind of get us thinking in this category. But ultimately, the panel is going to give you some wonderful insights from their own personal and professional experiences. So about 20 minutes or so, I'm going to give some slides just on this topic. So I am an art therapist. So progressive practices, expressive practices has been really my focus area. And when we talk about what is a progressive practice, it can really be almost anything, not quite anything, but almost anything. So a nature hike, equine therapy, drama therapy, writing, art, photography, music. And I want you to think beyond that. Like, what else could something outside the box be? You could roll in some holistic practices like acupuncture, Reiki. There's a lot of services on the market, I'll say, these days in terms of this type of methodology, right? But some are more effective than others. And again, I always try to listen and absorb like what clients are telling me works for them and what doesn't work for them. So it's different for everybody. We're going to really hone in on this list today. And I encourage, obviously, the panelists to bring in whatever experiences you find relevant in this topic area. So when we talk about, I want to give a little education on kind of like trauma, anxiety, depression, and why things that relate to imagery and metaphor and symbols work. That could be, again, that could be art, writing. It can be working with horses, right? Things that are kind of outside of the traditional scope of using words, and specifically using verbal therapy techniques. So imagery really is exactly what it is described by: using images, using metaphors, using symbols. We are innately, instinctually built to experience things through our senses, right? So part of that is what we hear, what we read. A lot of it is what we see and do. So when I talk about visual methods and experiential methods, those really rely on the act of seeing and doing. Again, whether that is doing an acting workshop or drawing a picture or writing or bringing in a song lyric, these are acts of seeing and doing. And there's a reason why, specifically with certain symptoms, certain challenges, I found those services to be, really powerful, not only powerful, but a lot more efficient in terms of getting to content that people really are looking to work on, right? So you'll get a client that comes to you desperately wanting to work on loss, let's just say, right? Let's generalize it for a moment. They don't have the words to describe what they're struggling with and how to kind of access that material that's stuck for them. And then you get them talking about song lyrics or writing a poem or taking a photograph, and all of a sudden they're able to do that more freely. So just a few examples to get us thinking again. And there's a couple quotes that I brought into it. You don't have to read all of the words on here, but Kathy Malchiotti writes a lot about this. And the big takeaway here is art therapy specifically focuses on inner experience, right? Feelings, perceptions, imagination. Many progressive practices do. So the focus becomes less on somebody saying, How do you feel about this? Or tell me what this was like, and more on the inner dialogue of how did you perceive that event, or where in your body did you perceive that event, right? It brings a different level of conversation to the table, and it pulls on things like imagination and imagery, and again, like things that maybe people can't find words to describe. A few benefits that I wanted to talk about now. These were taken from work groups that we had prior to this. So I asked these wonderful panelists who you're going to hear from soon, I asked them questions, and I was like, what do you find was helpful for you? And what do you think the benefits were? And they gave me a lot of insight and intel to build these slides. So one of the things they talked about were connections with self, connections with others, building insight, healing relationships, internal and external relationships, and then building perspective, which has to do with insight, right? But building ultimately those connections internally and externally. Helping with processing events. So again, when we struggle to find the words, think about a time where, and I'm going to challenge those who are signed on. Think about a time that you had a difficult experience, and later on, not the next day, I mean months later on, 3 to 9 months later, you wanted to process that. And you were trying to figure out a way to do that. You talked to a friend, you went to a therapy session, you tried a few different things, and you weren't sure how to process what happened, and it still felt stuck to you. What we're usually looking for is building narrative. Something about the narrative in my mind is stuck. This is kind of what fuels things like ruminative thinking, nightmares, intrusive thoughts. We get stuck on things, and then we put them on repeat in a way that may not be helpful, healthy, productive for us. And we try to find ways to build that narrative, but we're doing it the best that we know how. So processing, when we talk about any of those, trauma therapies or cognitive therapies, they're all about processing and reprocessing something that isn't working for us. So I want you to think about how these practices can aid in processing, right? And when we hear from the panelists, we're gonna hear more about their experiences in terms of what might be beneficial in terms of really like developing processing skills without even knowing it sometimes. So somebody might go to an equine session, which is a session with horses, horse-assisted therapy, and come out of it and be like, wow, like I'm thinking about this completely differently now, and I don't even know why. Or they might have a session with you where they bring in a piece of poetry or photographs that they created. And by the end of it, these shifts happen, and they're not really sure where or why or how they happen. And that's what we want. That's how we want these methods to work, taking the overthinking out of it and allowing the natural process to occur, which there's a scientific reason behind it that I'm going to go into for a second, but there's a reason why this really does help and work. Few samples, not too many. At the end of this, I'm going to show you samples from our actual panelists, and they're going to speak to some of their work. But just, a few samples from my work with clients. Imagery really helps people to go deeper sometimes, and to represent things. You'll see themes of alcohol, themes of suicide, themes of depression, darkness, themes of hope and motivation that are coming to life in images and in clay work and other things like that. And for example, this image on the right was a client who was really struggling to speak about what he'd been through, and did a series of these masks. I mean, 5, 10 of these disturbing looking masks. And he said the process was so helpful to him. And during that process, transformations happened where he became more comfortable and able to talk about what he'd been through. It was parallel to creating these masks that represented the struggle and the pain without putting any words to it, right? So there is kind of this magic that happens. One of the reasons why any expressive therapy does this is because it's not linear. It's not me saying, Danny, tell me about all of the terrible things you went through, right? It's me saying, Danny, this piece that you created, I see pain in it. Can you talk to me about the images? And then she can talk about not her pain, because that's uncomfortable for us. We don't really want to talk about our pain. Instead, she might say, well, in this image, you see XYZ. And that's what that means to me. So it becomes nonlinear. It's not just the conversation between me and Danny. Now it's the conversation about this piece of artwork that she created. So it's that third point. And again, it can be, I use art as a reference point because I've had the most experience with that as a clinician, but it can be anything, any type of expressive practice. But that third point of conversation is where a lot of the actual therapy happens. And we naturally project things that we've been through, right? If you've ever worked with children, you'll notice that we project our fears, or they project their fear. We do it too, but they project their fears and their worries and their concerns through play. Just the other day, I had an experience where my son was scared when he saw a Halloween decoration that had a pumpkin head, and he was genuinely scared. He's 3 years old, so he's genuinely scared, felt terrible. We were shopping in Target. It's like, where, did not expect this. And later that day, he talked to us a lot about pumpkins, and he wanted to buy a pumpkin and draw a scary face on it, totally unprompted, projecting these fears. And of course, we let him do all of it. And in the moment, kind of was like, okay, but in hindsight, I thought, wow, he was really working through what he'd been through, which was, I got scared of something with a pumpkin. So now I'd like to have a pumpkin and have it close to me and create a face on it. And we do this as human beings. We do this as adults. We suppress it more the older we get. These types of methods help us to access that in a way that causes processing, causes safety, right? Like, okay, now I'm talking about this thing that might be a source of fear or anxiety to me, but I'm not just saying, hey, this thing really freaks me out. Instead, I'm saying, all right, so I'm gonna use this session to work on my frustrations, or I'm gonna create a poem that represents a nightmare, or something that I think I'll never attain in my life. Now I'm actualizing what that is, right? And now, not only that, but I could have a conversation with somebody else based on this thing that I've projected into the world. All right, another benefit, I'm kind of blasting through these. There's endless benefits to expressive and progressive practices, but mindfulness and down regulation. Now, this expands beyond expressive therapies. This expands beyond music, art, writing, kind of those expressive tools, and also is super relevant with things like acupuncture and meditation and Tibetan bowls and all of these other kind of outside the box practices. So the reason why down regulation is such an important benefit that is overlooked often is because if you think of symptoms of anxiety and trauma, even depression, there's some things that are very upregulating. And if you look at the diagnostic criteria, you'll see things like, hypervigilance, panic attacks, right? And all of those things equal our systems being upregulated. And many of these methods, now the expressive ones, yes, but also other progressive tools help to downregulate our system. And not only in that moment, but they teach us and help us build the neural pathways to learn downregulation as a coping skill. It's not just a luxury for somebody to go to a yoga class necessarily. It's something that they need for many people, where they're learning downregulation. They're practicing downregulation. This might be somebody who's stressed out and anxious all day, and they're not able to just sit and say, all right, now I'm going to bring my system down. So they're using a service and a progressive tool in order to do that. Also helps us build emotional awareness in those moments, because when we have racing thoughts and when our brain is going, it's proven that we don't use our frontal cortex as much when the amygdala is activated, right? So we're not able to say, all of these things happened today and they stressed me out, and this is why I got triggered, because we're in that mode. So when we downregulate, all of a sudden you'll notice, like if you go for a walk even, you'll notice you're making connections. So any service that provides or paves the way for down regulation has huge therapeutic benefit. And very specifically for veterans, that's what we're here to talk about today. Many veterans have served in either a combat zone or in a training, where they're upregulated a lot of the time. I wouldn't say all of the time. For some, it's very consistent for an extended period of time, weeks, months, years, where that's what they need to do. That's what they're trained to do. And then when they come out of that, they've been up here for so long, it's very hard for them to suppress and learn how to bring down their regulatory processes, right? So these types of therapies really are hugely beneficial for them to learn that. And it goes right into heart rate, blood pressure, metabolism, circulation, breathing, all of these things that we really need when we're feeling stressed. All right. So real quick, this is the last main point. When we talk about trauma, trauma is like a big buzzword for veteran populations. Not every veteran has experienced trauma, but many have experienced either trauma or extended periods of stress, work-related stress. When we are under that type of stress, the way that our brain works is very sensory, right? So we go into instinctual reptilian mode, and that is very sensory and charged with our senses, hearing, seeing, visual, not so much memory and cognitive processes. So when we're talking about these types of practices, they're using the same area of the brain where that type of stress has been stored. And that's a good thing because we're able to reprocess and heal that area of our brain better when we're accessing it directly, right? So it's a big reason why scientifically why these type of methods work, and a lot of doctors and researchers have done a lot of work on this. So when stress or trauma is encoded, it goes into that fight, flight, or freeze area, and we experience those memories as usually these like fragmented, very charged, sensory charged memories. And when we talk about healing, how are you going to heal something like that when you just talk about it? Usually what's needed is something a little bit deeper or different that is visual, experiential, and or active. And what therapy is traditionally are none of those things. It's talk therapy is, sitting and having conversations and using dialogue. So movement and visuals are a huge, important part of healing, specifically from trauma. And when we're able to access that material, this is another quote from this great book here, Invisible Heroes, Survivors of Trauma and How They Heal. Accessing that material allows us to attach meaning to it and then move it to an adaptive resolution. I love that quote because I think it sums it up so beautifully. So release, catharsis, endorphin release, developing coping skills, actualizing our fears and our hopes, and all of that stuff that's under the surface that we want to talk about in therapy, but sometimes don't know how. And using metaphor and symbology can help us to do that much safer. And even a simple CBT exercise, people out there say, well, how am I going to do this? I'm not an art therapist. I'm not a music therapist. If you do just a Venn diagram and say, one side is who you are, one side is who you strive to be. This was a veteran who created this really elaborate Venn diagram off of that prompt. And you could see, this is art therapy, right? We don't have to call it that, but it's using visuals as opposed to talking about all this, which he was struggling to do. So anyone can really do this type of work. All right, for the sake of time, I'm going to skip through a couple of these quickly and get to our panelists in just a couple minutes. So panelists, you have about 5 minutes left until you're on. So this is your cue. All right. So we're all very different. We all need different things. So just a word of caution when we're doing this type of work, just because you bring a canvas into a session doesn't mean somebody's going to respond to it. That person might respond to, like I said, song lyrics or equine therapy or meditation, poetry. It could be, I always say, try different things, have conversations with your clients, give them a couple of assignments, see what they respond to. It's definitely an evolving process. And like what works for me is different than what works for everybody who's on today, right? So it's kind of a little bit of a trial and error in the beginning. But it's amazing when you can find that one thing that the person says, wow, this really resonates with me. This is really what I need. And they start bringing in much more elaborate content to the conversations through that method. That's when you know that that's the right one. And I always tell people, because they'll sometimes look at you like, what do you mean? I don't want to do this. I don't want to write, I just want to talk, because we're educating the clients about this as well. They don't necessarily know that all of the things that I just talked about, right? And why maybe they're hitting walls in therapy over and over again. So I'll say, just try something different. Let's try to do a series of photographs and see if that brings out anything different. Veterans aren't always open to using expressive or progressive practices. The ones on this panel today have been, so they're going to give us some insights. But if you have somebody who's not, don't let that scare you away. Like it's still good to encourage people to try new things and see what they respond to. So yeah, music. This was actually an acting group, and this was a quote from one of the veterans who was a colonel, who retired. And he said the parallels between acting and serving in the military were strong. A lot of people making it happen with sweat, guts, and smarts. I thought that was a really cool quote. And this was a quote from a Navy vet who was a photographer, really expressed himself so well through photography, and again, struggled to talk about some of the stuff, but would bring in these amazing photos with quotes that were very deep in meaning that then prompted conversations between us. Drum circles in a horse farm specifically. I had the honor of doing this type of work and with groups of first responders, and safe vulnerability is something that I like to talk about a lot because it's something that's so hard for us to find in the culture we live in, that's so fast paced and so reliant on cognitive verbal processes, right? So when we're dealing with complicated the content, whether that's a sexual trauma or post-traumatic stress or loss, bereavement, fear, sometimes participating in something like a drum circle for 40 minutes and then talking about how that was for you is going to be much easier than talking about those themes directly. Love this quote, the desire to hide and the desire to communicate all at the same time, right? So that's what expressive therapies do. They allow us to do both of those things. So on that topic of safe vulnerability. All right. I am going to introduce our panelists now. Danny gave me this. I didn't even know this before we met, but the art therapy was actually originated by a veteran. I'm an art therapist. I should know this, but I didn't. And he did. He was someone who served and did some work of his own artwork during World War I. First artist commissioned to do this type of work. So it's a fun fact. The other thing that a lot of veterans want to leave something behind, right? Whether that's, something to do with their family, something to do with a message or a principle or a sense of purpose or something to their next generation of those who are serving. But expressive therapies really are a way that help them to do that. It's kind of like a peripheral benefit to it, but I've found that many will say, well, this is something I'd like to give or show to somebody else to explain or describe what I've been through. All right. So with that super condensed bit of education on progressive practices, I hope that it gave you some kind of like insight just to build from, and our panelists are going to continue to do that for you today. This is really the bulk of the program is how they're going to kind of discuss their personal and professional experiences with using progressive practices. So I'm not going to read bios. I'm going to let them introduce themselves, but this is kind of just a snapshot of who we have on. Danny, Carl, John, and Jeremy all work in the field of working with vets, but also have their own military experience as well. So I do have some of Danny's artwork. Carl, I have your poem that you had sent to me, but I'm not going to just go on those slides until you tell me to. So I guess I'll leave this up for now and we'll segue into just a couple of questions. And then when you want me to present your work in conjunction with what you're saying to the group, just let me know and I'll be ready to do that. So I'll just open the floor by asking if you can tell us about yourself, your name, a little bit about your background, and why you're on this panel. Like what makes you passionate about this specifically, progressive practices in working with anxiety, depression, trauma with veterans?
Are you going to call on us or do you want us to just
I was just going to say, how do you want to do it? John, do you want to start?
Sure.
Okay.
My name is John Burgess. I'm a retired homicide detective from New York City. I then became a nurse for 15 years, a trauma burn nurse. And then for the age of 50, I decided to join the Army Reserves and deployed to Iraq. The big thing is when I came back, I ran the Joseph P. Dwyer Vet-to-Vet program in Putnam County. And part of that work was to try and find ways to reach out to veterans, and not necessarily the veteran that was at the VFW or the American Legion. It was the cellar dweller. It was the outlier. It was the individual that people couldn't find. And one of the things that we did was writing. One of the things we did was equine therapy with the Equus effect. And I was surprised at the success of it. So much so that we published, Carl and I worked together, 2 books that had artwork and photography and poems. We did artwork galleries with music, and their artwork was up. And how successful it was is why I'm passionate for this.
Thanks, John. Jeremy, do you want to go next?
Sure. So I have a varied life. My life trajectory's kind of gone all over the place. I was a musician after high school. I went to the Crane School of Music and studied orchestral percussion. I transferred down to the Albany area schools after my father passed away halfway through my freshman year, and had an opportunity to play with the Albany Symphony and the Catskill Symphony and the Utica Symphony and Schenectady Symphony, but I wasn't all that good. Good enough to get called when they needed a triangle player or something like that when we were doing the Nutcracker Suite. But it was a great experience. Loved it. Then I joined the Marine Corps, served from 1999 to 2004, and was medically discharged after I re-enlisted. They let the re-enlistment go through. They found out there were some anomalies in my blood work and found out I had Crohn's disease. So they said they couldn't deploy me anymore, and that was that. And so I kind of had to figure out what I was going to do. Used my GI Bill money to go back to school. I got a bachelor's in history and government from Skidmore, and then a master's in history and teaching from Union. And I was a teacher for about a decade. Loved it. Loved my time in the classroom. Loved the students. And then got out of it last year. Took over the position of coordinator for the Adirondack peer-to-peer program up here in upstate New York. And now we take care of vets. Love it. It's turning into my favorite job that I've ever had. So it's challenging, but these progressive practices, I think, certainly have a place in dealing with veterans, especially, I would say, after the last 4 years. I think we need to find new ways to reach out to veterans and help them heal.
Carl?
Hi, my name's Carl Rohde. I'm a Vietnam combat veteran. I still haven't decided what I want to be when I grow up. I've had several different jobs. I've been a telephone repairman, a teacher. I have, like Jeremy, I have a master's in history and another master's in education. Then this job came up. I'm the director of veteran services for Putnam County. I'm also a veteran service officer. And what I've discovered, I've been writing for years and years. I didn't realize it was therapy. I just knew I felt better when I wrote. It was something that helped me in good times and bad times. Recently, I've gotten away. I'm not writing anymore about, I traditionally wrote about a lot about my military service. Recently, my poems have taken a different direction. And John mentioned before equine therapy, which I can talk about equine therapy all day long. I went into it. John and a couple of other friends of ours talked me into going to it. Horses were the other red meat for me. I hated horses. And now I, as often as I can, I'm at one farm or another, sometimes just being there, not doing anything, just being there with horses. So it's a great program. It's, again, I don't look at it as therapy. I just, it helps veterans, helps first responders. It's a good thing. I don't know if I want you to show the poem yet. Maybe we'll do that later.
Yeah, we'll do that later.
Okay.
All right, Danny, tell us about you.
Hi, everyone. I am among the jack of all trades with my wonderful fellow veterans and panelists. So I was an artist before joining. I went to the School of Visual Arts in New York City for comic book illustration. And then I joined in 2011 when they opened up combat arms to females in the Army. I was denied by the Marine Corps because I had too many tattoos, and I'm still upset about it. So I joined the Army. I was in for 4 years. I also was medically discharged. I was a Home Depot rollover that broke my back, and they said you can either stay in and change your job to a desk job, basically, or get out. And I was like, I guess I have to get out. You know, I can't do the mission that I joined for. So after that, I came home. I had PTSD, I had MST, I had physical pain, I had postpartum depression, and there wasn't any female-oriented programs for me as a returnee to Long Island. And I went to the VA and I sat down in a chair and I said, you know, this is my story and this is what I'm dealing with. And it was kind of like a hot potato of like, oh, I don't know how to deal with your trauma. So I decided from that day forth to survive out of spite and go to school for 6 years to become an art therapist. And so I chose to use the skills I had as an artist and that type of safety to express myself, as well as learning the psychoeducation of what it's like to have PTSD. And fortunately enough, I've worked with victims of domestic violence and sexual assault at Vibes as a veteran counselor. I am currently working on substance abuse here at Outreach Recovery Center with veterans on the veteran track and outpatient services. I have been a homeless outreach coordinator for supportive services for veteran family members, working with homeless veterans, getting them into safe housing. I have worked with food insufficient veterans, getting them to access food. I've worked with mothers who, are needing necessities like diapers. When there was a diaper shortage, I'm pretty much the resource veteran. I can kind of guide any veteran in Suffolk County to a program or a assistance that they need, because there's a lot of gaps in services where we don't know how to access what is available to us. So that is something that is my most favorite job of all, is just being able to bridge that gap.
Thank you guys for the introductions. So you've all had these unique experiences, I'll call them, because if you think about, all service members, veterans out there, I think you're probably the minority of finding things that kind of help you in that way and are creative or expressive or progressive. And my question would be, because I've seen it so much, and I wonder if you have that, I don't even want to call it resistance, just that like hesitance to jump into these types of practices. Have you seen that in others? How would you suggest to this group who's of attendees today, like if somebody really wants to try to engage a client in this way, or maybe you yourself at first were not sure if it would work, or Danny, I know you said you were always an artist, but not everyone has that background. So how would you suggest bringing up these types of tools, specifically to a population that might be like, I'm not really sure if that's for me?
I was like Carl. Also, I want to mention about the horses. I was terrified of horses until I started participating in Warrior Ranch and learned about myself and how to get past that is also how I get past my own trauma. So just being aware of what you're afraid of and then actually facing the fear is huge. And sometimes the fear is looking stupid, and sometimes the fear is feeling like you're not adequate or that you're not going to be able to produce art, right? That it looks nice. And for our therapists, we understand that it's about the process, not the product. And for those who don't automatically align with the arts, I have things like tools like these wooden art sticks that are colored pencils, but they actually are actual sticks to feel more like you're in nature, more masculine for those who don't want crayons. But Marines always choose crayons anyway. So there's ways that you can,
The blue ones.
you can introduce different materials and see what they feel comfortable using.
I found with the equine program, my number one convert was Carl, and I'm sure he can talk to you about that. But most of the time, it was sort of like, try it. If it doesn't work, you don't like it, that's fine. I even got Carl to do yoga, if you can believe that. But that's because he found out he could nap at the end. But one of the things I found was that when we first started to try and pull together photographs, stories, poems, whatever it may have been, I was surprised how many people did it on their own. How many people, when they came back, wrote a poem? How many people wrote something, drew something? And we do a program, or we did a program, and it was involving writing. And one of the people that was there said, I can't write, I can't do poetry, I can't do anything, I can't do this, I can't. And the guy that was helping to facilitate it just helped walk him through one step at a time. What do you remember? What is it about? How was it? What was the temperature? And he ended up writing a poem, and he didn't even know he was doing it as it was happening. And it was quite amazing. But the equine program, I probably pushed over 100 people through that. And I would say that not one of them turned around and said it was a waste of time. The Equus effect was one of those things that I had looked at EGALA and all of these other programs, and I can understand a lot of people's hesitancy in doing some of those. But for the most part, whenever I tried somebody, it was, listen, try it. See if it works for you. If it doesn't, you move on. It's like you said, it's not one size fits all. Some people want photography. We had a photography class. Some people wanted drawing. We had an artist. So it's just a matter of trying what resonates. I mean, we even did fly fishing, and I like to fly fish. So it was whatever got you out and engaged, to find a little touch of your humanity that might have disappeared from.
Yeah, I totally agree with John. A lot of the trying phase of what you like and you don't like, you'd be surprised on how much you can grow a social network at the same time. So you may not like fly fishing, or for me, I did not like being in the actual arena with the horses, but I did like talking to the veterans on the outside. So I grew my social network with fellow veterans who I felt, seen and heard to talk to, because being a veteran or a first responder is a small niche of Americans. And so being around people that I felt comfortable around and felt like I am accepted here was what drew me into Warrior Ranch. And having the patriotism and having that camaraderie is what kept me there. So I didn't like per se to work with the horses at first, and now I'm much more comfortable. But it was just knowing that there's going to be people there who understand me, that is kind of worth that fail or succeed process that you might be afraid of.
Some of the things I feel like we have to obfuscate what we're doing. So we call yoga movement therapy. I feel like if we called it yoga, they wouldn't participate. And the other component, I feel like, actually there's two. We always offer food at events, whether it's before or after. That usually brings folks out. And because we're starting to develop such a tight-knit social network, word of mouth is quite effective. And we've become quite patient, I would say, trying different things and saying, well, it didn't work the first time, so let's abandon it. We don't do that. We continue to let it grow. So the word of mouth piece really is like, okay, if you get one or two veterans participating, what happens is they go and tell them at the more easily accessible social events, I would say, and say, man, that was a great time. You should come out. And Jeremy served food too. So then, if for no other reason they're coming to eat, but then they might dip their toe in the water, participate a little, albeit reluctantly. And then the more time goes on, the more they enjoy it, if they find that it appeals to them. And if not, they kind of fall to the wayside, or just enjoy the camaraderie and feel that there's a benefit from watching others participate. So it grows. You just have to be patient. And I think you'll find many of these, the equine therapy can get rather expensive, but some of these artistic, expressive means of dealing with trauma, they're not that expensive. So if you're looking, you go out there and you do some writing. I've had writing a therapist attend our Chinjacook weekend, and participation wasn't that great. I think it was because the weather was so beautiful that Memorial Day weekend, but they went to the women's retreat at Weowaka, and the women loved it. And then they came back and told everybody, like, oh, these ladies that conducted this session, we loved it. You really got to try it. And because they've developed such strong personal relationships, folks are willing to take a risk.
I just wanted to point something out, and Jeremy mentioned it indirectly, well, directly, which is just the opposite of my feeling. And this is something that's hard to say with the whole, several hundred future therapists here. I think the biggest thing and the biggest way that we've been successful, and the way our Equus effect that John was talking about has been effective, is we leave out the word therapist. If my experience with veterans has been, if I tell them I'm going to want you to go to some place for therapy, ain't going to happen. They're not going to go to it. You have to ease them into it. You have to, we promote the peer aspect of it, the socialization, without talking about therapy. Equus Effect will tell you point blank, they're not therapists. It's not a therapy program. The Equus Effect has no social workers or psychologists working with them like Egala does. So that's been our key. We don't, we try to stay away from using the word therapy in any of things. Be it yoga, the writing workshop, not, eventually we get other originally it's veterans that like to write, but eventually we get other veterans involved in that. And again, staying away from the word therapy.
Yeah. We never used it in any of the things that we did, and we tried multiple events. I mean, we did cooking class, and you had a great chef who was teaching people how to prepare basic meals. And all of a sudden people, they loved doing it. They thought it was great. It's because they're handling knives and stuff like that. They thought it was fun. But, for the most part, it was, none of it, never did we say, this is a therapy for you. That's your guy's job. My job is to try and connect with the veteran and gain his trust, he'll trust me, and then I can make a reference. And then I can say, what do you need? And hopefully that'll work.
So each time we do a question, I'm just taking a couple notes that I'm going to drop in the chat box for everybody, just to kind of capture what they're saying, because I think it's great insights that come up in the moment, and I'm always like, oh, that's really good. So yeah, I just put kind of the summary of that response in there. Just segueing into the next question, I touched on the idea of like a safe vulnerability. Can you guys speak to that a little bit from the perspective of somebody who's served, what vulnerability means to you as a concept, maybe how that goes against your training, and then maybe how you were able to maybe feel vulnerable in these types of moments or instances or with these services in a way that's different than me being like, tell me how you feel. Which can feel like an unsafe vulnerability I found with clients. Can you speak to that a little bit?
I can definitely speak to that, especially with working with horses. So I have found that I work better with the mares, which are the female horses, rather than the geldings or the male horses. And I actually can relate it a lot back to my trauma in the military, because I was the only female in a 40-man platoon, that you cannot be vulnerable, and you always have to be on guard. And that hypervigilance, it gets exhausting. And so when I see the one female to the 5 males who are acting the fool in the corner, trying to get her attention, and she's just unbothered, she's doing her own thing, she's listening, I love that, because I love being like, all right, that's how I feel when I'm in a room, or when I was serving, I couldn't be distracted. I had to be paying attention to what the mission is, because if I didn't, I would fail, and I would fail my team. And as a female, it's a lot harder, because you have to have a much higher standard when you're one of the first females to ever do a man's job. And so when I work with females, I feel more comfortable, but I also have to be vulnerable to work with the male horses. And Warrior Ranch has done a brilliant way of just throwing me in it. And having especially the males horses behind, and I would constantly be looking behind me and saying, and they're like, no, stare ahead, you're guiding that horse, you need to be looking forward, because the horse trusts you, and he's going to follow where you go. You keep looking back, he's going to be like, what are you doing? And so having that, all right, I have to trust who's behind me, I have to trust that I know what I'm doing, I have to always look forward and not keep looking back, is a huge metaphor for anyone who's in a recovery state. And sometimes when you're always in that hypervigilance, or you're always having so super self-aware, you could feel like, you know, kind of ashamed to it. But then when you realize that it's a herd mentality, these horses they could feel fly on the back of them, and they have to, you know, react because they are prey. Even though they're these huge, majestic beasts, they're prey animals. And so they can't show vulnerability, they can't show weakness or sickness, because if they do, and then they're going to be the first one out of that herd who's going to be taken down by a wolf or whatever predator is in that area. So they don't often show when they're in pain, and veterans can be very prideful and conditioned to do the same. And just to accept like where you are in life, like I am struggling and I do have to, you know, recognize that, I think is a huge part of how to get better. And like the biofeedback of those horses, like responding to your behaviors and your moods, like when you walk in the arena, and if you're in the proximity of a horse and you're heated or nervous or scared, like they're gonna know. Like you could fool a person, but you can't fool a horse. And you have to be aware of your breathing and checking in with yourself, like your own emotional state, because they know. And sometimes they'll come to you because they know that you're like a little worried, depending on the personality of that horse, or they'll, you know, stay away, and because they're like, what's going on with that person? So it just is a reflection of like how you enter the environment and how you are a part of your environment. And some people, they need that, the introspect and the extrospect of like, you know, of other people and being around them, like your energy, your confidence, like how are you going to establish strong boundaries? Like all of these things are all associated with your life and working with horses, and your body language, the nonverbal communication, the rhythmic pressure of just showing them where to go. You don't have to tell them physically, it's nonverbal, and you don't have to whip them, you don't have to touch them at all. You just have to motion to them and they're going to move. And that is something that I think is really powerful for someone who has been a victim, to feel empowered again, that, you know, you can move a 2,000-pound horse by just moving your arm or or just waving something in the air. So I've had a lot of growth since the 2 years that I started working with the horses.
I think also, you know, when you think of the identity of who a veteran is, you know, we're the protectors. We're the ones with the shield. We're the ones that are supposed to be the strong ones. We're the ones that, you know, you call when you're in trouble. And then, you know, you leave the military and your identity is gone. And, you know, so in order to admit something, we use the term vulnerability, you have to admit to your weakness. And a lot of people don't want to do that. I think one of the most surprising things I learned during one of our writing groups was a young female veteran who was the victim of, we use the term MST, but she was raped while she was in the military and violent. And she wrote a poem about it. And to share that's courage. That was courageous on her part. She couldn't read it, so we had it up and somebody else read it. But it was one of those things that you're trying to bring them back to that, being that courageous person again, and to have that shield up and to be the strong person. And the other part I found with most of the veterans that I've dealt with, almost every single one of them wanted to find out a way to serve. No matter what they had been through, no matter what they had done, when they came back, they wanted to figure out a way that they could continue to serve. And so they were the ones that wanted to go and, you know, if I do the horse therapy, can I help people do that? Can I, like Carl, be a horse handler? Can I be there? Can I do something? I was always surprised at that. It was an amazing concept that this is something that they continue to do, even after they've already done it. And I can't speak enough about the horses, but it's, you know, one of those things, like she said, you've got to leave you at the door. And you know, when I was running the program, you know, and I'm going to do this thing with the horse, I'm like, okay, I got to be out of here in 15 minutes. I got to do this. I got to do this. I got to, you know, I'm here. And I tried to walk over to the horse and it turned around and walked away from me. So like, you can't hide something. And then it just taught me how I'm supposed to, like, you know, bring myself back to ground, you know, to ground myself in there. So there's a lot of things in there that you can learn, and a lot of things that are important.
A lot of grounding.
Not one thing that can work.
and retraining your brain too to like replace those negative memories and those emotions with like positive interactions, like being afraid of someone behind you, like you're now okay with someone behind you, like the just also like you said, like the trainers, like meeting Carl or someone who brings you into that, like you start to feel like, oh, I have purpose, I have meaning, like I'm part of the team again, this is my cohort. And like that is an amazing feeling because we do have that sense of purpose in us. And as military members, like selfless sacrifice is one of the biggest traits that fuels us. And if you can help someone else, you're going to be there. And so being there is enough. And that's the best part about having this community.
And to piggyback on what they're saying, this is one of the things that I've emphasized is the importance of the peer role. A lot of barriers don't exist between fellow military personnel. So when you have peers on the ground that are doing outreach amongst the particular cohort that you're trying to affect, if they're willing to take those risks, they're sometimes it's easier for them to follow the lead of a peer because they're like, they've been there, and they're going to open up, they're going to make themselves vulnerable because you have that shared experience. Now obviously we have to go into specialized areas. The MST point is really one thing that has to be handled by someone who's experienced that or a specialist in that, so as to do no harm. Because this is one of the things that we're still trying to set up here is our support groups. And one of the things that I'm finding quite frequently, and it's sad because I had to deal with this stuff when I was in the Marine Corps. I saw one of my Marines, attempt to sexually assault one of the younger female Marines, and I pounded the snot out of him, and I brought him before the command, and I was like, okay, they're going to handle it, but the guy didn't get NJP'd, he didn't get page 11, he didn't get anything, no court martial, and she had to see him every day at work, and I was like, how does that work? What the hell, So, the peer element is important because it just breaks that barrier down. And up here, like I said, with the music therapy, we're trying to set up a group where we're just going to have a music listening session, and we're going to advertise it as like, oh, bring your favorite song from the 60s, right? And we're going to have it, and obviously we'll serve food. But since I think the 60s are one of those decades of music, that music period that most everybody likes, maybe not kids nowadays, but certainly from my generation, obviously older or younger, give or take 10 years, they still can find something that they'll be like, oh, I remember this song, let's bring it in and talk about it. And it's something, music elicits so many emotions and responses. You can trigger memories, things that we remember, the first time, first dance, first kiss, first tune that was on the radio when we got our license. Those kinds of things, they bring back so much. It's an opportunity to see if there's enough interest to say, okay, now we're going to start inviting an actual music therapist, and which is something a little bit different. Those that are licensed to do that stuff, they do an assessment. They take account of trauma, what type of cognitive abilities, what age group, what are their interests, that type of stuff. So, but the peer element, I think, is the gateway. When we have good veterans on the ground that are able to, prompt these discussions and get the ball rolling and say, hey, what do you think about doing this? And then, see where it goes from there.
I just wanted to comment one thing, and both Danny and John, when they were talking about the equine therapy, I think it's something, how it impacted me. And to me, when we're with we call it the herd, and we're with 5 or 6 horses in an Equus Effect program, to me, they're the perfect platoon. They're just like a military platoon. The military platoon is established for us to go out on a mission, to have each other's back, to be hyper vigilant, to make sure everybody's safe, to make sure everybody returns. The difference is, and this is what the horses teach us, when we get back from our mission, even when we become civilians, we don't release. We stay hyper vigilant. We don't take that breath. We don't graze. And the horses taught us to graze. That if the danger isn't there, graze. You don't have to be hyper vigilant. That's what the horse taught to me. And I think, and John, if John wants to corroborate this, I think we've gotten more effective in our equus programs since most of our horse handlers now are veterans. The facilitators are not veterans, which is fine, but the horse handlers now are veterans. And I think it's made it even a more impactful and effective program. So it's the perfect platoon. I wish more veterans would learn. We got to relax.
I don't want to keep on harping on, the horse and equine program, but, and the equus effect, because I've had so much success with writing and music and art and so on and so forth. But I'll tell you two things about the horse handlers. You don't really communicate with the individual while you're going through what you're doing. It's this camaraderie during lunch, again, to what Jeremy said, we feed them, of having this conversation. And we try and explain to people before they come. So don't expect you're going to get something. This is not like, hey, you're going to come in and this is what's going to happen. And when they ask you, well, what's it like? What is it doing? For the most part, everybody answers, can't really tell you. But I can tell you at the end, it's this. And I'll say one thing, and I don't mean to embarrass Carl. One of the horses they had to put down. And they stuck with it. They stayed there because that horse was part of their platoon. That's part of the military culture. That's part of the thing of, they said, I'm not going to let Bo, horse, die alone without one of us being.
Stay there the whole day with them.
Yeah, that's an amazing thing. You wouldn't think that of a combat veteran, Silver Star recipient, Vietnam grouchy old man, but he was.
There definitely is, like, also the ranks in between the platoon too. You have 1 for 1, so you have the leader of that herd or that platoon, and then you have second, third. And they're always like a pecking order. They're always like testing each other for that kind of establishing dominance. And I always love, in the military, there's that like little bit of underlying competition, right, between the branches and between individuals. So they still have that, even though they're a herd, they'll always test each other. And so you have to make sure that when you're in with them, that who's 1 for 1, but then also like you kind of establish it within yourselves. And then once you get comfortable and you start getting that competitive, like fun, energy, then you get to really kind of show your side of like, okay, like I'm going to take what I've learned, the skills that I've now learned, which is the healthy coping skill of grooming, and then the horsemanship, and then you can like move on to like roping or any other like specialty within the horses too. So it's like there's a versatility in it. Like there's definitely ways where it's not just one thing you can do with a horse. There's actually like many different styles of working with a horse, or just opportunities to learn about yourself is the same as like art and music. There's so many ways that you can use that tool to help someone. And I think that's why it's become very popular within the veteran community, because it works, because you are able to say, all right, this trainer is a little, old school. He's, a little firm, and this person is a little more relaxed. Like the trainers become those positive role models where they can either be like light as feather, firm as necessary, or the second they walk in that and it's on. So I think if you resonate with like that type of, you're looking for something to look up to, like that leadership that you used to have, it's also kind of healing to kind of remember like those times of like, oh man, like I have a trainer at Warrior Ranch, reminds me of my first team leader. He was 82nd Airborne. They're like 30 years apart with the same person, and those kind of like wholesome memories is very nostalgic too. It was just the personality types that you remember, like of time when you felt very proud in your life.
All right, so I'm going to ask you guys one more question, and then I want to open it up to see if anyone wants to share like a piece or a few pieces of their own. I brought up this idea of, and I love everything you guys are saying. I just dropped the notes again in the chat box for everybody based on your responses. Always inspired by these. Thank you for putting so much out there. I brought up the idea of narrative, right? And I think that's something that we all, as humans, like we strive to create our story. And there's gaps in our story sometimes where there's traumas or difficulties or challenges. And I was wondering if you could speak to how some of these processes help to build stories or put pieces together that might feel disjointed, or where there's gaps, and kind of what these processes can do, just for that specifically, if you can speak to that.
I guess I'll jump in. I found sometimes with the writing group was where I found that you can create this sort of story. And sometimes when we were doing the writing group, it wasn't that you had sort of like a technical thing that you had to write for. A lot of times it was just something that flowed out of it. And, you know, you'd start with an idea or a concept, and then things just came along, they just came out. And then when you went back and you looked at a lot of the things that you wrote, you could see that these were things that really represented your life. And sometimes they don't have to be complete stories, and sometimes they don't have to be, you know, complete, you know, works of art or books. One of the veterans that we dealt with, he made paper out of his uniform, and he found that extremely fulfilling. And then he had a picture of the Vietnam veterans wall down in Washington, D.C. And in a simple typewriter type, he had underneath it, he said, I think life would have been so much easier if my name had been here. I mean, that gives you so much to work with that person, and brings up so much and connects so much as to who he is. And it came to, it wasn't something that he, you know, like, I got to work on this, and, you know, I'm going to bang this nail, and, you know, that's how I'm going to get it. It just came to, it flowed out of it. And for me, that's how, with me, with writing, because I can't draw for shit, excuse me, person. It's the writing that does it for me. You know, it just makes these connections. I play connected dot, and that's how it works for me.
What I think it is part of the narrative is not really the art or the painting or the music. It's that, for me, when people hear it and they realize that as a veteran, I'm not just a former soldier. It's more than that. One of John's and my friends, she brought her two daughters to a veterans event, and I've told this story many times, where we were reading poetry, and I happened to be reading a play, and her young daughters on the way home said, "Mommy, we didn't know veterans wrote poetry or plays," and people don't know that. And I think that's an important part of the narrative, not necessarily what we wrote, but that we wrote.
To piggyback on what Carl said, I was very fortunate enough when I was speaking to the state legislators several months ago. There happened to be a filmmaker from France, as a matter of fact, Patrick. He's awesome. And he heard us talk about, you know, some of the issues that we face with the Dwyer program, and some of the issues that we're facing with veterans in New York in general. And he asked if he could shadow me for a couple of days, because he's working on a documentary. And I was very fortunate that many veterans were willing to conduct an interview with him. And he came back totally blown away. You know, in his mind, and he's an educated guy, he's no dummy, but in his mind, he's like, well, veterans are all the same. And he said, I have to come back and conduct more interviews. So now, this was back in February. He's still compiling material, because so many veterans are willing to come out and tell their story, you know. And he's understanding that we come from such varied backgrounds. We had such varied experiences when we were in, and who it turned us into, because that's what it does. It dramatically changes who we are, you know, is not always the same. You know, I think Hollywood and many of the movies that come out have done veterans a disservice, because, you know, many of the movies depict us as, bloodthirsty killers, and that's what we do. And or sometimes, I think it's just, this idealized Hollywood image. And he was really taken aback, and he's like, this is far more complex than I anticipated, and it requires more work. So our approach to veterans and getting them to open up, and the narrative itself, we have to go in with the same approach, saying like, oh, what might work for one person is not necessarily going to work for another. And what's put out is, that's going back to what John said. There's especially with writing, I found this when I was working on my senior thesis and my master's thesis. Writing is very personal. And if someone goes into a writing session thinking that you're going to read it out loud or make copies for the group, they might run the other direction. They have to understand that this might take time to develop the confidence to be vulnerable like that, because some folks have spelling issues, grammar issues, and any type of artistic outlet, there's always that idea that someone's going to be judging it. And you kind of, you hate to say, well, we're going to create a safe space, but these types of alternative therapies are extremely helpful. And we have to be we have to understand that veterans and first responders might be reluctant to partake in that, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be persistent in trying to get them out there, even if they just sit and observe. Even if they just sit back and let everybody else do the work, because you might have some folks that are at different stages of vulnerability, right? So, I mean, so you have some folks who've come to 3 or 4 sessions, and they're like, oh, I'm getting comfortable with this, and let those folks that want to sit back and not participate, they will when they want, or they may not at all. But the product and the willingness to go out there and expose these their problems is going to vary person to person, experience to experience, and we have to be patient.
I think with the storytelling, there's a magic in it of being able to change the character of a story. So for me, when I was working on my story, writing my story, I had a lot of shame in my story because of how I left the military before I was ready. And it took me a long time to change that narrative to being proud of what I had done within those years. And when you write a story, like, you can choose whether or not you can be each character and what of that personality traits that you want to portray. And I think when you have these veterans who are able to tell their story and do these interviews, it shows the individual and that we are still humans, even though we're veterans, and that we were in a community and we were in a collective, and we were broken down to then all be right dress for a certain amount of years, but at the end of the day, we're still always going to be human. And telling your story gives another person's story validation. And for me, I struggled with telling my story at first when I threw it out, because I didn't want people to investigate what happened, because I didn't want to have other people involved. Because of my situation and my military sexual trauma, it happened to be a company who was a corrupt company, and it was many females, it was a ring, it was something that was very big, and I didn't want the people to be interviewed through all and bring out their trauma, right? I knew it was mine, but I didn't want, if they were not ready, I didn't want them to be contacted. And it's funny because I'm going to shout out to Danielle, Katie on this call, because I saw Katie on this call, and then automatically I was like, that I was stationed with Katie, and she happens to be his wife, right? And so even me telling my story now, this has been 10 years since I was stationed there, right? But at the same time, he probably doesn't know that I was a military sexual trauma survivor, but if she told him, right, he's gonna have a different perspective of me. He knew me as a strong female leader, and I didn't I wasn't in the point of my life where I have been in the last decade of struggling. So it's hard to, know that your narrative changes throughout your time, and to go backwards and is really hard for some people. And even just telling your story where you're involved with a bunch of people is hard. But those stories are what's most important, because every time I tell my story, there's another female or another male who says like, wow, she knows what I've been through, and it validates their experience. Whereas if you don't talk about it, those numbers are skewed, and the people who are not reporting, their voices don't get heard, their justice isn't going to be served, and there's not going to be change. So the more people who do those interviews and tell your story and tell that you are a part of history. If you joined the military and you did, your goals to help your community and to be patriotic, and any reason that you chose whichever specific MOS that you had done, that's something that should be documented and for, years to come.
Just wanted to add one thing about how receptive a lot of times these programs are to other veterans, and how sort of like welcoming they are. I had an individual who had joined the military, and for whatever reason, after a short period of time, after raising his right hand in support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, both foreign and domestic, he was removed from the military. He had a bad time, went to prison, and prison broke him. And so he had some serious mental health issues. But when I found out that he had served or raised his right hand to join the Army, and I asked the people in the writing group when it was first taking over that he would like to join us, just to sort of like hang out with other people, every single one of them said yes. And it's nothing personal. Nobody there turned around and said, no, you can't be here because you didn't do blah, blah, blah. Everybody was receptive to him. And so it's always one of those things that, again, like Carl said, Jeremy said, there's more to us than people realize. We're not just the guys who march in parades. So that was something that I thought was very interesting and important.
Thank you guys so much. So I do want to allow for questions, but I also, maybe before doing that, does anyone want to share any pieces that they might have? I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but if you have something, either a poem you want to read or artwork.
You can post mine if you wanted to.
Okay. It's in 3 parts because I wanted people to be able to. Carl, do you want to read it also, as I can move the screens as you read it, or they can just read it themselves? It's up to you.
This is one John has not seen, so it's a newer one. I thought I had a copy of it. I don't. It's a completely different from anything I've written before. It's about emotions, the heart, being in love. I don't have a copy to read, so I thought I had it, and I don't.
Well, it's up on the screen here. There's 3 parts. I'll leave this for a second and give everyone a chance to read, and then I'll move on to the second screen and then the third. Carl, do you want to give any context, or like, was this done in a writing workshop or on your own, or?
This is completely on my own. This is after we had a writer's workshop that sort of died with COVID, and going through some emotional things on a personal level that had nothing to do with I think 90% of what I've written prior to this, and I've a few of these. I just wanted to write about something different, and this is something that was impacting me personally, and so I wrote about it.
I think it's a
And-
beautiful example of metaphor and using metaphor to express something deeper. Sorry,
And
John.
I probably would think it's the only poem in the world that talks about Fruit Loops. So
John, were you going to say something before? I thought I heard someone.
I was going to say, Carl, don't worry about it. You are a Fruit Loop, but I could read something if you wanted to, but we could wait until everybody else has done it.
Yeah, I think John, now would be a good time. I know you had sent it to me. I didn't have time to put it on the slides, but it's called Regrets or Things in the Attic. Love that title.
So, things in the attic. He takes down the suitcase. It is of old rattan wood and leather. The attic has held it silent for many years. An unknown emotion moved him to look one last time. The dust clings to the small spaces in the weave, reluctant to display its contents. Two brass clasps are stiff and dull. The hinges creak, showing their age, as if it knows. The cigar box is the first thing he sees. It's an interesting design, of some long ago company. The Cubans he smuggled, snuck through customs like a spy would. Its lid opens easily. He almost expected a light to shine, like in a movie, illuminating his face. He touches the medals of his youth, pretty, but useless, except for a grandson to wear as he plays soldier. If he only knew the cost. He takes a few with their ribbons and absently puts them in his pocket, and then sees his pocket knife, given to him by a family friend on a train in Paris. He was all of 12 and a swashbuckling hero, and immediately cut himself slicing an orange. How old is it now, he wonders. The years are too many to count easily. So he gives up, as it too finds his pocket. The items he sought now secure, he absently ponders the rest. A uniform he no longer fits in. Then he sees a picture in a frame, face down, but he knows who it is. It's of her. He touches it and leaves it. A small vintage typewriter catches his eye. He had almost forgotten. When he was away, he wrote to her with it. She couldn't read his letters otherwise, she had told him. It was a gift as he headed off to war. But that was a long time ago, when their love was new and it was unbreakable. And then he found out the world can break you. He remembers lines he read. Hemingway, the world breaks everyone. Those that will not break, it kills. It killed their love, that it killed her. He holds his father's pocket watch, then its gold chain, coins and foreign notes, silver dollars, cufflinks and matching studs when he wore such clothes. Now in his cabin, what was their cabin? Now it's boots, jeans, and t-shirts, except on a chilly day, like that day, a plaid shirt, Orvis usually. A crackling fireplace, he runs his hand through his long graying hair, almost to his collar. I need a trim, he says to himself. It is soft and fine and thin, going like the memories before him, before they used that word, before when it was neat and trim, uniform. He looks at the patches of departments he worked, of those he ran. His duplicate shield is there. It too finds its way into a pocket. Other pieces of his life have been hidden here. His decoder ring he got as a child. He drank Ovaltine day and night for months, till the day it came in the mail. He returns it to the box and closes it. Since he can wait no longer, he reaches and lifts the picture. She smiles up at him. She too is radiant. Although it is black and white, you can tell the color of her eyes. He thinks of what could have been. This was supposed to be their time. The house sold for a cabin in the woods and land and water. There must be water, she insisted, small but cozy. But it was enough for them, the kids and their kids. One summer week it had been perfect, the sounds of laughter, their dog running, barking. children all about, some sleeping in bags on the floor, the parents in the loft, they in the bump out spare room. It was when the picture was taken. He can still hear the joy, the ice cold lake, walks along the paths he cut, the campfire, then sorrow. After sleeping on the couch, an ache that didn't go away. Getting old, they thought. Then the conversation. How much time? Everyone asks, as if they know. Months to a year. It was a month to the day. The children no longer come. They were hers after all. He became sullen and angry. They no longer cared about him. Even the dog died. Then his word appeared from the past, dementia. Now it's just him and ghosts that follow. He put back everything he removed, but he kept out the photograph. He carried the box and the typewriter down the ladder to his desk. He typed a note, placed it on the box. Holding the photograph as he walked about, he drank his gin. Satisfied, he unlocked the front door, made the call and hung up before any questions. He sat in his red leather chair, looked at the love of his life as the fireplace burned, and he picked up the gun.
Beautiful, John. Thank you so much for that. We got some great feedback in the chat boxes as well for both of you guys.
Lovely work.
Danny, you want to shift gears and show some of your artwork?
Surely.
I just kind of put these in the order they came in, but you can kind of, I put them all in there. I couldn't choose, so.
I sent a bunch, thank you. So ironically, the first ones are ceramic, and I hate clay work. I hate the feeling of it. I was never really good at it. But learning through the process again of, teaching yourself to relearn, right? And to learn new things and be open to failure. The face on the left-hand side is called Metal Militia or Metal Medusa, depends on my day. It was inspired by Medusa. It does have carbine shells in the background. It was kind of like her little sneak head is kind of also looking like is it an exploded cartridge at the same time. And that had a lot to do with, the story of Medusa and being a sexual assault survivor, and then also being in the military and MST. So that was the theme around that one. The one on the right-hand side is much thinner, so it cracked. So it in the process, right? One thing about clay is you never know what's going to happen. You could put it in the fern, I forget what it's called, and it could just shatter, right? It could be, you could have thought it was perfect and you modeled it the way it should be, but it shatters. So that one did shatter, so it wasn't supposed to be. And the process to do that was raku, which is when you take a bunch of newspapers and you light them on fire and you put them over a metal container. And the way that the ceramic paint kind of forges creates those patterning in it. And for me, being someone of sexual assault, I had these reminiscing feelings of being dirty. And so that piece to me was like, you could scrub it all you want, and those cracks and the dinginess is always going to stay because of that raku process. Even though it's smooth to the touch, the cracks are actually underneath in the paint. And I am very intentional, so I don't like clay making because clay making is non-habitual. It's kind of like a surprise. If you want to move to the next one.
Yeah. I just want to say, Danny, I thought I didn't realize that was something that happened in the process and that you just went with it. You were like, this is life. We break sometimes. I'm going to just go with this.
Yeah.
The cracks seem like part of it.
Yeah. And that's a beauty in it too, is just like being able to take the whatever experience is happening and make something the best out of it, those little happy surprises, happy mistakes. This image also has to do with MST. There's lyrics from a Perfect Circle song that says, little angel go away, the devil has my ear today, I'll never hear a word you say. That's the red ink that you see around it. And it's a military member behind another military member in the same uniform, because had I reflected on the uniform, I was very hesitant to put it back on. After the experience that happened for me, I was like, how can I wear the same uniform that someone else is wearing, and who could trespass against someone who's supposed to be their sister in arms? So that was a difficulty for me. And then I didn't report it either. So it was kind of like the secret I was holding. And I always felt there was like kind of this person behind me who's just waiting and waiting. And I never felt safe after that. So that was what that image is of. And even though I was a very strong person and everyone usually sees me as that, that is the picture of me. And, I am being strangled. And that's basically what it felt like for 4 fucking years. Sorry. The image next to it is a poem. It is about a paratrooper, an English paratrooper that I fell in love with. I don't know if I can read it out loud, but I'll try. You're everything I promised, you said. Hold on, I can't see, it's too small. Can you read it? I can't read it.
Is that
Oh,
better?
there you go. Perfect. Okay. You're the best I ever had, you promise. I will you're making it smaller.
Right, there we go.
You're the best I ever had, you promise. I will never get bored of you, you swore. I will never tie my shoes to run, you promise. But none of my baggage ever set aside your faraway shore. You're the girl that guys take for granted, you guessed, even on the first day. Then promised you would never do the same. But I guess then came the more important things in your life that got in the way. When you were given an out, you declined, sure of what you knew. She is a part of you, and there is no one else other than you that I would ever want, even in a filled room. On my wings, you proclaimed, I do not know what tomorrow brings, but I am so happy when I see her face. Words that still resonate in my mind, yet there have been so many months since that day. I'm sure that these memories are long since packed away, along with your jump jackets that hold clouds in your pockets. But for me, I can still hear your heart race, smile lines around your eyes, freckled lip, an exaggerated smile. Still missing you each and every day that goes on. I just tell myself to let go, that our time has passed. There will be no more war stories of you having to stand fast. Stand up, hook up, shuffle out the door. Out jumps the man I've always hoped for. And being a soldier in love with another soldier is a whole another webinar that we could disclose. It would take a long time for those layers of drama. Do you want to go to the next one, Lisa?
Sure.
And it's a paratrooper jumping out of a C-130. This image is both these images are actually in my office. So my population is substance abuse, and often there's many similarities between being incarcerated and veterans and people in the military, and the layers of trauma and the things that we experience. So I like for them to see who I was. And being an MP, you would think there is going to be a barrier. But often it's good for the communication to be honest and open. Like, I was that side of the law. And if you're here for a DUI or for, if you're mandated by the courts, a lot of times there's a hesitancy to want to be in treatment. And so I try to be as open and honest so that they know what they're getting when they see me as a counselor and that they feel comfortable. And I also have to make sure they know who they're sitting down with. And I had substance abuse while I was in the military when I broke my back. And so I'm very open and honest about that, and how I probably couldn't push forward with the mission if I wasn't given all of those painkillers and wasn't, allowed to stop. I had to keep going. And so that created a bad habit and some negative coping, that it was the only tools I had at the time. And the image is actually from the rollover that broke my back in Fort Drum in 2013. That was like a picture I had taken on my phone in the ambulance. And then there's a picture of me like integrated into mixed media. And on the left-hand side is a image of a stress fire. So it was one of the weapon calls that we had that you do push-ups and like all this crazy stuff, and they try to get you really stressed and really flustered. And then you shoot, and obviously it's not going to be perfect, but you have to show that you can like handle yourself in situations. And they have poppy flowers at the bottom. I use my dog tags as like that, one of the marks in it. The sergeant rank is inside of there. And then underneath it is a picture of me firing without stress, and how perfect and dead on inside each of the three were in each other. And because I was able to self-regulate and calm my breathing and use the tools that I was taught, and sometimes, and for me in the stress test, it really reminded me of like when there were certain men around who I knew I felt uncomfortable with, and I automatically went back to that feeling. And it's really hard to describe, but that image for me is just like, it means a lot, even though it looks really chaotic and crazy. And I don't like that type of art for the most part. I'm very intense with, I have, my marks mean things. So I have a lot of work with line making, even with my clients in here. You know, if they come into my session and they are having like these really like thin lines that are very heavy, you know, I know they're not having a good day. I know that they're not in it. Their mind's somewhere else. And when you give somebody choice, that is something that they may not have had if they were incarcerated or if they were a veteran. And so giving them the opportunity to try different mediums, using clay, using model magic, using markers and watercolor. I've even brought in a stamp maker and an etcher, because for our welders out there and the men who like more mechanical tools, you know, I've tried to really be versatile with the different art that we use. And I do use music, and I do use anything that they find to be expressive. But a lot of the times I've also found that even both veterans, you know, you leave your hometown because you may not have the resources that you want to grow as a person, and you didn't have the opportunity to really be fulfilled in the artistry or be exposed to these different things. Is the same thing as someone who's incarcerated young. And so a lot of the times it's just the experimentation and the cathartic body movements that they have playing with all these things, that is really enjoyable, you know, and can really change how they feel about art. I'm gonna go to the next slide.
Yep. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut this one off too.
No, you're good. It's
But I
okay.
like the polarity. I didn't realize the bottom one
Yeah.
represented the opposite of that, which is cool.
Thanks.
Yeah.
And the anonymity that comes along with art as well, right? That desire to hide and communicate with safe vulnerability is perfect for, you know, that artist mentality. The image on the left is myself in uniform. It shows my age because the ACU is not what they have now. It's way cooler. And like, you know, my medications for the month, and at the time, me kind of wondering what my spirituality was at the time in my sober journey. And that's a reflection of a lot of different things. And what I was going through as a single mom and a veteran, and, you know, dual military couple, and a lot of different things. And that was a very, very rough time in my life. On the opposite side is Maria. She's a Marine. She found art therapy as well. She's also an art therapist, and she's claim making. It's a Semper Fi, which means always faithful. And she had a lot of combat trauma from the Iraq War, and she found, you know, solace in the art studio. And she has her pack next to her and her rank. And it was just a very beautiful, I think, portrait of a strong woman who's trying to find herself again. And being both soft and feminine and vulnerable, but then also being masculine and strong and powerful is kind of this duality that a lot of female veterans face. And it's hard to choose what you want to be and how you want to be every day. And the storytelling of who you are and your story changes for each chapter. And art, luckily, is one of the ways that we can express that, and non-verbally too. I mean, I for a long time, my voice would shake when I told my story. Not so much anymore, but you'd be surprised. You know, the tears will fall sometimes. But there's a lot of power in having the choice to not tell it's your story, it's a story. It brings you out of it. So you were able to tell something with a little more like firm and a little more authentic, I think, if you don't have that shame capacity and you don't have you know, people being like, oh, well, will that happen to you? Like, I can't believe it. Like the shock factor and the not being believed is one of the hardest feelings to feel when someone tells you their trauma. And if I had any advice to anyone working with veterans, if you feel as if you can't talk about violence, if you feel that you can't talk about rape or death or being used by the system or anything hard, if you can't have a hard conversation, if you feel uncomfortable about suicidality or with substance abuse or weapons, like this is probably not the population for you. Because the second of you get in front of a veteran and they feel as if you're not confident in your abilities, the trust will be lost. And these are things that are on their minds. These are things that they struggle with. And if they don't feel comfortable talking to you and you're their mental health support, then you have to educate yourself or find some support in a way that you can better handle that situation, because it'll be a huge disservice. I don't know if any of the fellows on the panel would want to talk a little bit about that.
Surprised we haven't cursed as much as we usually do.
I know, I already ruined it. Our good streak, our cookie jar. Yeah. But John, you spoke to it before about, you know, the importance of being confident in what you know and the suicidality piece. I mean, you have a lot of experience on that.
I'm also, for some of the people that are on the thing, I'm also a county coroner, so I deal with suicides quite often. We've got more this year than we usually do. But again, it's one of those things you have to be honest with the people that you're talking to. You know, we had a veteran come and they had just taken the gun out of his hand, and he was going to kill himself in front of his family. Or another veteran that was going to kill himself, you know, but he had told the police, "You're going to be the ones that are going to kill him." And you have to be honest and straightforward with them. And one individual that they took the gun away, you know, the question was, do you trust me? And if you trust me, then let's go together. You know, I got the T-shirt, dude. I got the coffee mug. Been there, done that. I know what you're going through. And you know, it's one of those things that there's so much fear and so much the unknown that's going to happen to this individual. They're going to red flag them. They're going to do this. They're going to do that. You know, the only couple of conversations that I've ever had with most of them is when you're sitting in the emergency room and they ask you how you're doing. The answer is not fine. Okay. The answer is not I'm 2 thumbs up, rocking and rolling, high speed, low drag. Be honest with them. And, you know, where they're going to be going, they have to be honest. But that's the biggest thing of just dealing with it. You have to be honest with them.
I do want to open it for questions too, in case anyone's compelled, they have a burning question they want to kind of pose to our panelists. Just be mindful of just respect and, you know, sensitivity when asking these. But I want to open it up in the last few minutes to see if anyone has questions. And before I do, just like, you guys are amazing. Thank you so much for putting yourselves out there and sharing your perspectives and insights and your heart, and really demonstrating through, you know, live action what the benefits are to some of these practices that we talked about today. So we really appreciate it. And attendees, do you have any questions that you want to drop? I'm kind of keeping an eye on the chat box to see if any come in that way. There's so many people on it, it gets lost really quickly, but a lot of great feedback for all of you.
You know, there's also, for many of us, there's no single trigger. You know, it's not like, you know, oh, they're remembering this or this part of combat. Or, you know, for a lot of us, it was, for me, I can't speak for everybody else, it was guilt. You know, I couldn't save everybody. You know, so it was the ones that died that gave me the regret. And when I tell people that I was a cop, you know, I was a detective in the homicide squad. I retired 10 days before September 11th. You know, I lost a lot of friends that day, and I continue to lose friends to 9/11 illnesses. And every day I sort of think to myself, I should have been there. So part of me is always trying to even that out, that I should have been there. I should have done something. I should have been part of it. And so that's why I became a nurse, and that's why I, you know, went to Iraq, and that's why I worked in the busiest trauma center in the world, and that's why all this. And I'll tell you one thing, 20 years in the police department, and I investigated dead babies, children, you name it, I did it. It was Iraq that kept me in there, and it was Iraq that gave me a flashback. So, and that was 8 years after I came back. And I was as surprised as anybody. I was watching a movie with George Clooney. I mean, everybody loves George Clooney. I love George Clooney. I'd marry him if you asked me. But it's like, all of a sudden, bang. And I was backing around, treating a captain who's going to die on me. And that's when I realized I needed help. That's when I turned around and went, uh-oh, I'm scared. And that's when I went to finally get some help. And so each one of us is a little bit different.
So one person posed the question about transference or countertransference, and I think Jeremy, you specifically spoke a lot about the importance of peers, and I think you all resonate with that idea of how important it is to have peers in all types of veteran work, not just with these types of practices. But how do you balance that out when you might have your own feelings of transference, maybe with the people that you're working with?
It's I would say it's tricky not bringing stuff home. It's tricky to keep focused on the mission. I would say there's a tremendous amount of importance on, like, they call it self-care now, but I think being in good physical shape is helpful. I think knowing when to say when, having folks that you can lean on within your community. It's tough, and someone alluded to it before about conveying weakness. It's something we just don't do well, because we're supposed to be bulletproof and all this other stuff. But, when you kind of internalize a lot of this, because when you're dealing with peers, the last thing you want to do is express emotion that is possibly going to exacerbate what they're going through at that moment. You kind of got to be a sponge, and then figure out the best solution, and then deal with it later. And you got to be careful. Substance abuse issues, you're like, oh, I'll just have a couple drinks or something like that. But alcohol, we all know this, gets its hooks in you, you're in trouble. So you got to find an outlet, whatever that is. And now that we're discussing progressive practices, art, writing, music, these are all ways that we can really blow off some steam that's really helpful, healthy, and possibly we could bring to the table to help those veterans that we're meant to help. So it's tricky. It really is, and sometimes you're dealing with veterans that are in dire situations. And I had a couple of buddies take their own lives. It's always on the back of your mind. You're like, oh, and that's the worst part with suicide, I feel like, is because there's so many unanswered questions, you have a tendency to blame yourself. You're like, oh, I should have reached out more, I should have been there, and you coulda, woulda, shoulda, and it's always on the back of my mind when dealing with this. And I think sometimes it's good that I'm salary, because if I actually equated my hours, you'd be like, man, you're nuts. Because you're answering the phone at all hours of the night. The last thing you want is to read about someone that you're working with that hurt themselves, because automatically you're going to blame yourself. But you got to balance that out, and you just got to find that outlet. It's tricky, and you have to know yourself, but recognize that someone told me this years ago when I was a young teacher, and he said, oh, you can't save everybody. And I was like, yeah, bullshit, but you got to do the best you can at all times and keep people on the radar, but use the resources at your disposal. But just know that, doing the best you can is the best you can do. Sometimes things don't always go the way we plan.
All right, time for one other question. Thank you, Jeremy. That was a great answer. Somebody asked for recommendations in case somebody has a reaction during a session like this that might be delayed after the session. And somebody else asked about the length of time in between service and utilizing practices like this. Similar, same ballpark, but kind of different questions. Can anyone speak to either of those?
I think with the time question, you're in different life, you do different parts of life. You have different perspectives of what you need from therapy. So if it's been a decade, you might have, you know, struggled, or you might have processed a certain way, and you know, as you've gotten older, those feelings and those thoughts might have changed over time. So I wouldn't know what's the best. Like, obviously, if you know you're struggling when you first get out, get help. If you know you're struggling 5 years, get help. If it's been 20 years, get help. It doesn't matter like time length in that sense, but you're just different parts of your life that may be the military may be affecting your job or your relationship or your parenting that you don't realize, and those stressors are starting to come up for you. So always get help. The time since you've been in the military, I don't think is that different. Does that make sense? I don't know if I'm explaining it right.
Yes.
Like I said, I mean, for me, it
Yeah.
was 8 years later. You know, I mean, and then when we went back and examined it, you know, there were a lot of things that were happening before that I just never paid attention to, because I was like, yeah, you know, whatever. And finally, after we pulled it all together, and I realized that I needed to be able to talk to somebody who knew what they were doing, you know, that's when we started to realize, hey, this is not only just happened, but it's been going on for years. You're just now aware of it. You know? And like I said, it was basically, you know, I don't watch war movies. Not me anymore. But we figured we'd watch a movie with George Clooney. Like I said, it was Monuments Men. World War II, they're chasing paintings. And the next thing you know, they're doing something with a native case, and someone's calling for morphine. And I'm back in Iraq calling for morphine for a captain who's going to die. And again, that was like, that surprised me, you know, and scared me. I did not expect it. I really didn't, because as Jeremy said before, we're bulletproof.
And for the veterans who feel, or the clinicians or anyone within the veteran population who are working with someone who they think might be re-traumatized or triggered and they need help after the session, 988 suicide hotline, press 1 for a veteran, you'll speak to another veteran. There's many 24-hour hotlines that have veterans who are responding to veterans that will be beneficial for them, where they don't have to kind of worry about that cultural competency piece that they may be lacking, right? If you build that rapport with them and you're not available 24/7 and they need extra support, like 100%, just make sure you have those at your, you know, access to give them.
Great, guys. Thank you so much. I know we had a technical difficulty maybe with the link, and Amelia is going to resend it in just a moment. So if you're still on, please stay on so you could get the evaluation link in just a second before we wrap up.